I want to welcome you to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Mishpatim, which means laws. And, I'm going to focus in on what may be the most important word at the beginning of this portion. The fact is, in Hebrew, it's not even really a word. But in English, it's the word and. The portion begins with the word and. These are the laws. Now, for those of you who know Hebrew, you will remember that there is really no separate word in Hebrew for and. And is simply a syllable that is attached to the following word. So, v. And this portion begins, ve'ele. Ve'ele. And these are the laws that you shall put before the people. But what's the importance of that word and? Well, and is a conjunction, which means that it joins this portion to what came before. And given the fact that this and comes right at the very beginning of the portion, ve'ele, and these, it means it connects it to last week's Torah portion. So what was in last week's Torah portion? We had the revelation at Mount Sinai, the Decalogue, the so-called Ten Commandments. And of course, it is a misconception that many people have that somehow the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, that is all that Moses received on Mount Sinai. But our Torah portion begins by saying, and these are the laws. So guess what? You remember that stuff from last week? Yeah, you remember the story of the revelation with all the thunder and lightning and all of the drama, and then the 10 statements that God made. Well, guess what? Now come the laws in their detail that really form the core of the revelation. And so that's the significance of beginning this portion with the word and. As a matter of fact, Rashi comments on this, and he says that the fact that it begins with and tells us that just as the Decalogue was given at Mount Sinai, so these laws that are given in this week's Torah portion were given at Mount Sinai. Now, one thing we could ask is, what are the laws? And I can tell you there are a lot of laws in this week's Torah portion. There are many, many mitzvot. But, if I were to simply stop somebody and ask them, tell me, what do you think are some Jewish laws? A lot of people would probably say, well, Judaism has dietary laws. There are laws pertaining to the observance of the Sabbath. There are also laws pertaining to the observance of various holidays. And, people are familiar with these things. Now, as a matter of fact, there are some dietary laws in this week's Torah portion. The law against eating treif is to be found here. Now, treif, by the way, if we properly understand it, means the meat from an animal that has already been killed, generally by another animal. So if somebody is out and finds a dead animal, that meat is treif, and therefore it cannot be eaten. Also in this week's Torah portion, we have the first of 3 times that the Torah tells us you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And of course, this is where we get the whole separation of meat and dairy products. And because this commandment is repeated 3 times in the Torah, the rabbis understand that to mean that it prohibits three different things. That you're not allowed to cook meat and milk together, you're not allowed to eat meat and milk that have been cooked together, and you're not allowed to have any benefit from meat and milk that is cooked together. So there are some dietary laws in this portion. Indeed, the 3 festivals are actually mentioned in this week's Torah portion, and there's even a brief reference to the Shabbos. But if you read through this week's Torah portion, you're going to find that the bulk of it is what we would call civil and criminal law. That is to say, laws, mitzvot, that pertain to civil damages, to things like negligence, property damage, damage that is done to another person. Also, laws pertaining to things like kidnapping, stealing, murdering, injuring someone. So the bulk of this Torah portion are not ritual laws, but laws that pertain to, again, civil matters, torts, and the like, and criminal matters. Now, the fact is, if we look back at last week's Torah portion and we look at, again, the so-called 10 Commandments, I've heard people make statements like, wouldn't it be great if everyone would just observe the 10 Commandments? Wouldn't the world be a better place? And look, far be it from me to say no. If no one would murder, steal, or commit adultery, the world would be a better place. I don't think there's any question about that. But let's face it, you can't run a society just based on those sort of very fundamental laws of human society. The fact is, any human society has to have those prohibitions against adultery, against stealing, and against murder. And then also in those 10 Commandments, we have honor your father and your mother, which I would say is also just fundamental to any properly run society. Because the fact is, the next generation of citizens in a society is raised by their parents. Ultimately, the basic teachings of what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, what is decent and indecent, what is proper and improper, all of those things we learn ultimately from our parents. And that's why we have to have a respect for them and for the teaching that they transmit to us. Notice it doesn't say love your mother and your father. It says honor. The whole point is we have to give respect and regard to our parents because they're the ones who transmit to us these fundamental teachings of right and wrong. And so that, I would say, is something that's going to be part of any society that functions in a proper way. And then also in the 10 Commandments, we have the basic laws of monotheism, that we shall have no other gods before the one God who brought us out of Egypt. And of course, the Sabbath, the observance of the Sabbath, which is also commanded in the 10 Commandments, which is certainly the most fundamental commandment of the Jewish religion. And so those things are, those are important. They're the highlights, they're the headlines, but they're not sufficient for running a society. And that's why the continuation of the revelation that we have in this week's Torah portion goes on to give us the specific laws for how we're going to deal with our neighbors, with the other people with whom we're living. What happens if somebody does something that is negligent? What happens if somebody does something that causes either physical or monetary harm to someone else? Those are the kinds of laws that are discussed in this week's Torah portion, which are absolutely necessary in order to live together in a society. Also, even those fundamental laws like you shall not murder, that is clearly basic, but it's not so simple. There are situations in which supposedly it is appropriate, perhaps, to kill someone. Obviously, there is the issue of self-defense that I think we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. The Torah does enshrine the idea of self-defense. We also have seen that the Torah speaks about war, about the mitzvahs that govern war. There is such an idea of an ethical war. Well, one thing about war is people are going to be killed. So certainly that commandment, "Thou shalt not murder," that needs a lot more information with it in order for us to conduct our lives. And that's not even to speak of the very, tricky and controversial issues of things like abortion and euthanasia and the like. So certainly those headlines in the Ten Commandments are basic, they're fundamental, but they're not sufficient to run a society. And this week's Torah portion, which provides us with so many more commandments, fill in a lot of the missing information. And, the fact is that in halacha, in the Jewish law as it developed, if we look at the Talmud, there are huge sections of the Talmud. There are several tractates of the Talmud that deal with torts, civil law, and criminal law. And those sections of the Talmud, there are the three Babas. There's Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Batra, also Sanhedrin, which deals with criminal law. Those huge tractates in the Talmud are based almost entirely on this week's Torah portion. So this portion really is at the very heart of halacha, of Jewish law. And what we see from this is that the Torah was meant for the governance of a society, of an entire society, with all of the various aspects that go into life. Things of how to conduct business, how to deal with your neighbors, how to deal with people who commit various offenses, and so on. And so Jewish law is meant to be all-encompassing. And the fact is, to this very day, there are Jewish courts. There are rabbis who specialize in the halachas of business, for instance. I can tell you here in Chicago, there is what's called the Choshen Mishpat Kollel. Choshen Mishpat is the section of the Shulchan Aruch that deals with business law. And there are rabbis who really specialize in these areas. And indeed, I can tell you that they receive questions from people who ask them, "I'm engaged in the following business situation. Is it permitted for me to do X, Y, or Z?" And as we said, when there are disputes between Orthodox Jews, they are supposed to take their business disputes, to a Beit Din, rather than to a secular court, because there is an entire Jewish legal system that is incumbent upon us. And I'll tell you, I'm going to end with a joke today, because now that I've mentioned the idea of taking a business dispute to a Beit Din, it reminds me of this joke, that there were two Orthodox Jews, and these were guys who were super Orthodox, big beards, kapotas, yarmulkes on their head, and they go to a secular court for some dispute that they're having. And it's just clear that they're lying through their teeth. So finally, the judge, who also happens to be a Jew, turns to them and says to them in Yiddish, and unfortunately I can't tell you what the Yiddish was, but he says to them in Yiddish, "Look, you guys are embarrassing. Why don't you just go to the Beit Din?" So they turn to the judge and they say, if we went to the Beit Din, we'd have to tell the truth. So on that note, I wish you a good Shabbos, stay safe, and I hope that you will take a look at this week's Torah portion and see really the amount of detail that we have in terms of Jewish laws that govern life. Good Shabbos.